All right, I think we're ready to go. It's 2 past the top of the hour. I'm going to turn on my camera and ask my speakers to do the same. Let me get you guys back to the slides. So welcome, everyone. Really excited about today's topic. The future of MarTech is warehouse native, Snowflake connected. I want to thank everyone for joining us. This has been something I was talking to Luke and Jacques just before we got started here, how excited I've been to host today's webinar and really excited to have our panelists joining us. Really appreciate their time as well. I hope everyone who's attending gets value from this topic. And as always, I want to remember a couple logistics for all of you that are attending. One of which is that we will be recording this, and of course you will get the content after the webinar. And then the second one, I think is important to mention as well. We will have time at the end for Q&A, live Q&A. So please feel free to submit questions at any time through the GoToWebinar interface, and we'll have time at the end to address some of those, which we look forward to. So that'll be live, but then again, you'll get the recording after the webinar, even if you were unable to make it in person today. So with that being said, I'd like to shift to just a quick intro of today's panelists. My voice, my face, I'm Walter. I run the partnerships organization at MessageGears. I've been with us for about 5 years. Really excited to have Luke join us from Snowflake to provide that perspective. And then Jacques, really appreciate your time joining us from the UK. Not only is he a practitioner of MarTech, but he happens to be a moderator of the very popular Email Geeks Slack organization, and I think was one of the kind of founding members of that community many years ago, which all of us participate in pretty heavily for those of us that are in sort of the ESP customer engagement landscape. So Jacques, really appreciate your time, and Luke, you as well. As we get going, I did want to kind of lay out, and Luke was needling me before the call, which I say with a smile, but this is a pretty rich agenda. I tend to like to kind of lay it out for folks that are attending. You'll notice that we have about 35 to 40 minutes of kind of planned discussion time. We did book the full hour just in case we got a little wordy. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we certainly plan to have time at the end to take questions through the questions interface in your GoToWebinar experience. So please submit questions as they come to mind, and then we will have time at the end to address those. So please do that. But as you'll notice, we will start with Jacques and really digging into some of his background and perspectives and experiences. I'm not going to talk through this entire agenda, but you guys can get a flavor of that as you look at it. Jacques kind of got on my radar almost a year ago, not only by virtue of his role in the Email Geeks community, but also this article that he wrote back in April that was pretty impactful, at least from our perspective, in terms of talking about some trends that Jacques is seeing in his expertise and industry. Then we have Luke joining us from Snowflake, really just to give us his perspective and the perspective of Snowflake on some of these trends that Jacques will be talking about. And then finally, you'll hear a little bit from me in terms of the MessageGears point of view and what our own clients are doing, and the benefits that flow from that around B2C MarTech use cases. And then, as I mentioned at the end, we'll have time for Q&A. So that's the big picture for the day. And Jacques, it's time for you to, oops, I didn't want to go there next. I'm actually going to keep it right on this agenda slide until we get to Luke. So Jacques, it's really time for you, my friend. I'd love you to kind of go off mute and tell us a little bit about your background and industry experience. We'd love to hear more about you and kind of what got us to today.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that introduction. Really excited to be here speaking with everyone. So a little bit about my background. I've been in the email world, I want to say now about 11 years. I think as a lot of other people in this industry fell into it completely by accident, working for an e-commerce brand. At the time, I think we were using eCircle. Are they still around? They might have rebranded a few times since. But you know, this was the good old days of if you want data in your SP, you can do it via SFTP. And I've kind of been, and I've seen the trend and the change in how ESPs and marketing technology ingests data for the decade plus that I've been in the industry. So kind of from SFTPs, APIs, CDPs, direct integrations through all sorts of various kind of flavors amongst that. It's been really exciting to kind of see that happening. As I said, kind of, you know, primarily I've been working email and CRM kind of marketing. So started with email, but then quickly kind of focused on, you know, push messaging, SMS messaging, web push, all those other kind of traditional CRM channels, and then kind of slowly migrated into more of a marketing operations role. And that's kind of taking a little bit of a step back and refocusing a little bit, looking at kind of the bigger picture. So instead of just looking at the SP and the CRM, the marketing automation platform, taking a bit of a step back and looking at actually what is the whole kind of technology stack looking like for the marketing team. And now I'm kind of in a revenue operations role, so I'm doing that, but in an even broader capacity, serving that function for the marketing, sales, and customer experience teams. And that's kind of really exciting, I think, because we're starting to see some real kind of shifts happening. And it's very easy as a marketing practitioner to kind of really get stuck in your own way of thinking. You know, you've got your tools that you use day to day. But actually, in reality, you're not the only team that needs to send emails. You're not the only team that needs to contact customers. You're not the only team that needs to have an understanding of who your customer is. Your sales team, your customer experience, customer support teams, customer success teams, your product team often, and any kind of other kind of teams you might have in the industry and organization. So what I'm really looking into and what I'm really excited by is kind of the enablement side of marketing technology and these kind of technologies we're going to be talking about today, and really looking at the big picture. And a lot of the time that means, you know, you don't focus on the little thing, you focus on the big thing. So CRM is great, love CRM, love ESPs, love maps. What's the big picture? How do you enable as many people as possible? And how do you give as many people as possible within the organization the same view and understanding of the customer, so that if your marketing or your sales team are talking about leads, to someone else in another department understand what that means? If you're sending an email, is it going through the same kind of infrastructure, the same systems? Can the same people kind of access the email, right? I think we've all been in organizations where you know, you'll have a transactional system that is maybe hidden away behind your engineering team, and suddenly your customer support team is like, what are we sending to our customers? And no one knows, because there's no communication, there's no kind of big, no one's really taking the time to build that big picture view. So that's kind of really interesting trend that I've kind of been looking at. And part of that then is like, okay, so we're thinking about this big picture stuff. Fundamentally, it all needs the same data, right? And that's where we start getting into the interesting stuff, I think. We have this kind of shared view of the customer that's enabled through data. And what we're starting to see is actually the data warehouse is becoming that champion. You can model your data warehouse any way you want, and you can expose as much data to as many people as you feel is appropriate within your organization. And the important thing is that data can be modeled in a way that is consistent to all of those teams. So everyone knows what a customer means, everyone knows what a sale means, everyone knows what anything means, right? And that's really exciting. It also means that you can do some really interesting things and start to aggregate data in the warehouse into those tools that other teams might not necessarily kind of view, or that you wouldn't necessarily use for marketing purposes. So nice example for us, you know, we use a tool called Pendo that allows us to kind of give pop-ups within our application. We gather that data and we feed it back into our warehouse, and suddenly the marketing team can act on that data in tools that wouldn't traditionally be connected to Pendo. So that allows us a great deal of flexibility in the way that we can market, the way that we can communicate to our customers, even for our sales team to understand what what our customers and what our leads, what our prospects are actually seeing and being exposed to within our platforms. So that's kind of something that I'm really interested and excited in seeing, and we're seeing more and more of that. And we're seeing, I read this thing last year, and it's all about this shift that we're seeing in industry, where we're seeing really the warehouse, the cloud warehouse, as the center of the industry, the center of the organization. And we're starting to see more and more businesses and more professionals kind of really understanding that, and understanding the challenges that come both in trying to build that and in trying to make sure that you build the ecosystem around it as well. So that's kind of, I think, a nice little intro there.
You gave us a lot, Jacques. That was incredible. So as an 11-year practitioner in the email and then MarTech and then RevOps space, if you were to boil down some of the common challenges over those 11 years that, to some extent are addressed by this new model that you're talking about in terms of the cloud, the data cloud, the cloud warehouse being the central source of truth. But what it's sort of before that was the case, what were some of the common pains that you had in your role, over the years, from your perspective?
I mean, the pain as always was just never having the right data that I needed, or having some data, but it being potentially incorrect or not in the right format. And that's something that this shift has really helped to prevent. And one thing I really like telling my team is that, when you're looking at technology, forget about the technology, focus on the outcome. And the outcome with this new technology is much more exciting and much easier to bring to market than previous methods. And I think that's like the real message that I want to kind of commit to here, is that it's all about the outcome, and this really enables a really positive outcome. All those challenges that I had previously were, I had to speak to engineering teams. But one place I worked at, I had to go speak to the DBA and get them to manually extract the actual customer list. Oh, suddenly it's more than 1 million rows. Oh, well, I can't open it in Excel and work with it. I didn't know SQL at the time. And so suddenly, you have all of these weird little challenges that really do pop up quite often. And this is just a really nice way to get around that.
Perfect. Yeah, I think you nailed it. It's sometimes people don't know the minutia of a MarTech practitioner like yourself in terms of the challenges of getting accurate real-time data, and having to submit a request to your engineering colleagues to run a report and generate a file that you then have to manipulate, and then you have to upload it to a third-party SaaS solution, which is not connected to your data warehouse. Some of that, I assume you would agree with that in terms of those are kind of the history of some of the friction that folks like yourself has experienced. Is that a fair statement, Jacques?
Yeah, something else that you're not saying there is that one thing I'm concerned by, and I say this kind of generally, is just the data risks that we have in this industry, right? We have access to a lot of sensitive data, and the more we kind of do those manual extracts, we've all worked from home, we've probably all used our own personal devices. Hopefully we've not downloaded customer files to our own devices, but that's something that happens really commonly, right? And so this technology allows us to kind of get around these risks by not exposing that data in the first place. So yes, all those challenges, but also these other things that are becoming increasingly important. We've got the GDPR, we've got America looking to introduce a variety of kind of data privacy regulations. This stuff is just only going to become more and more important.
Agreed. Super good point. The data security aspect. So taking aside the operational friction that you've experienced in your role over the years, it's also, especially now in the era of GDPR and CCPA and additional regulations coming, really having your first party data locked down in a secure environment that everyone is connecting to with the right privileges, and not having it floating around in 10 different places is pretty darn important for all kinds of reasons that you were just alluding to there. So that was a super good point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring Luke into the conversation now, if I could, Luke. And if you want to elaborate on anything that Jacques just described, that would be great. And then we can dig into kind of the Snowflake point of view on some of these topics. And Luke, I do have some slides for you as well, I'll have in the background while you talk, but would love for you to join us, and feel free to build upon anything that Jacques just said, and then bring us into the Snowflake perspective and point of view on some of these trends.
Yeah, and kind of to build on what y'all were just talking about, right? I think consumers are also kind of expecting, right, some better privacy and some better control of how you're using, their data, right? So it's not only from regulation side. I think it's like we're becoming, consumers are becoming more privacy centric as well with that. And so, Jacques, it's actually, you made some interesting points. Really the rise of the customer data platform was brought on by this need to have marketers have a centralized location to where they can work with their data. And you said that the data warehouse is kind of also become that for others as well. It's something you kind of mentioned there. You said before you didn't know SQL. One question I wanted to ask you: what kind of propelled you to learn SQL and to become maybe a little bit more technical as a marketer?
Yeah, so actually, Walter, there's a slide that you've not shown yet, but it really highlights kind of the problem that we used to have, and that propelled. Keep going. Yeah. So this, right? So we had exactly this problem, and this was an exercise I did at CyberSmart a couple of years ago. We mapped out all of our MarTech, and we mapped out the data flows between those different platforms. And we quickly realized it was a mess, right? You had some stuff going via the CDP, some stuff going into CRM, some stuff going into these other systems, some systems sitting completely isolated, some stuff going via manual CSVs, and a mess, right? And so I had a conversation with our CTO, I had a conversation with some of the senior engineers, and we're just like, okay, we need a warehouse, right? We need to solve this. And so we formed a team within the organization, Project Big Brain, we've called it, which is a good one. And we basically said, right, we need a warehouse, and we need to start being able to do some advanced kind of BI off the back of that warehouse. So we implemented an Athena warehouse. We implemented Looker as a BI tool, and really I started learning SQL purely as a need to start being able to develop things in Looker. So that for me was really the impetus to do that. Was I have this problem that I'm challenged with right now, and I need to find a way around it. Yeah.
And I think one of the highlight for me of that story is that y'all were able to work so well with your data team from the marketing side, right? And that's honestly where I see a lot of friction, right? The data team is not talking to the marketing team is not talking to the data team. And in my experience, I've seen, sometimes the data team gets to pick the CDP, and the marketing team gets to pick the ESP, and neither gets input over the other. And it's just I would say it's a huge problem these days with many organizations. And that's one of the things I think we want to talk to, Walter, is I think that actually plays a huge impact into kind of what solution, in MarTech you end up going with. As you said, with your Operation Big Brain, Jacques, it's not everybody, not every marketing team has access to a strong data engineering team to help them with that. And so they kind of get stuck on their own island. The marketing kind of gets stuck on their own island. They're forced to maybe make a less than ideal choice. Even I'll say in the ESP world, it's very common to hear that no ESP is perfect, right? It's always, what's the one that's the least bad for your team. So I'd say sometimes marketers are faced, with a decision that they have to go and and pick something that maybe it's not ideal, but it's the one that's gonna work the most with the resources that they have.
Luke, I was thinking for our audience, it'd be great if you could just dig into, if you don't mind, just the sort of the mission. I love this quote from Frank, so I have this up there for you, but then also if you could just educate the audience on kind of what Snowflake sees and your POV on some of these topics that you and Jacques have been talking about. I think that'd be super helpful for the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's, Jacques kind of mentioned the cloud data warehouse, or even Snowflake. We think we've moved past being a cloud data warehouse, right? It's that was Snowflake 3-4 years ago. That's what our core offering was. Now we're seeing that the new wave is we're seeing more and more companies, organizations, partners building on top of the Snowflake Data Cloud, right? And so this is where Frank's quote comes in here. It's you're no longer moving data to your applications; the applications are coming to your data, and so that's where that business logic, that processing is happening instead of in the applications themselves. And it's in the context of MarTech, we're seeing really, these, again, they're called, there's connected applications, right? And also in the concept of MarTech, you have what we're seeing, I guess, is two main patterns, right? One pattern being a connected app, and one pattern being a managed app. With a connected app, you are, again, connecting directly to the customer's data, and you're using that where it lives. Whereas in a managed app, you're using data sharing to, again, maybe get some data, like you're talking about, Jacques. Sometimes you don't have access, your ESP or whoever it might be doesn't have all that access, and they need to tap into the warehouse to get some of that data. Maybe it's offline data, maybe point of sale data, or something else that that your ESP or even your CDP may not ever have access to. And so that's where we're seeing more of a managed app approach of just, hey, let's get some of that data out of the data warehouse, right, out of your Snowflake Data Cloud, and get that to that platform to help. And so those are the kind of the two main patterns that we're seeing, that Snowflake is seeing from a MarTech perspective today.
No, that's super helpful, and I'm sure, Luke, you noticed I pulled up this visual, which I find helps kind of frame the differences that you just described. And this came from one of your colleagues about a year ago. So we've just borrowed it, and I found it to be pretty helpful. Luke, do you want to talk about the Snowflake Marketplace aspect of the Snowflake Data Cloud, or do you want me to do it? I'm happy to talk about it in a little bit.
Yeah, we both can, Walter. We both can, for sure. No, yeah, it's I'll say that a lot of organizations, we're seeing more and more of our customers use Snowflake's idea of data collaboration for their business, right? That might be the marketplace where you can go in and enrich your data and take data sets from, whether that's weather data or whether that's financial data, and take that to enrich what you know about your customers. That's one use case. It might be Snowflake is again, with the applications on top of Snowflake, if Snowflake has a native application framework, right? Where very soon here you will be able to do something like identity resolution within your Snowflake data cloud, within your account. Again, using an application that's running in your data all inside of Snowflake, instead of having to, again, ship your data back and forth to an external provider. And of course, the last thing, of course, data collaboration is the kind of the data sharing aspect. Again, what I mentioned with managed apps, a lot of our partners are using data sharing, again, to just eliminate that both kind of ETL and reverse ETL flows, that you can share data directly. As part of this, the sharing aspect, you can also bring in clean rooms, right? So Snowflake is starting to work with a lot of advertisers on the sell side to effectively activate data for on the buy side to run their ads on their platform. So you look at like NBC or Disney that we're starting to work with for clean rooms as well, which effectively, to back up a bit, a clean room is, for those who don't know, it's a way for two parties to work off of the same data without having really any access to the other party's data, right? So Snowflake enables that because of our enhance or our way, our engine of separating storage from compute, we can do that. Not in really, we're the only data platform that can do it in that way as well. I'm sorry, that was a ramble there, Walter.
No, that's good, and I'll cover it a little bit myself here in just a second. But I do, as I always say to partners and prospects of MessageGears, the Snowflake marketplace and clean room technology is a real differentiator for marketing use cases, and it's frankly it's transformative and to some extent disruptive relative to traditional ways of solving for some of these use cases that are, kind of like what Jacques was talking about. There's just full of friction and time delays and overhead and headache, and where Snowflake is taking us in that area is pretty exciting. So I'll get to some of that in just a second. So we are going to transition to just having me educate the audience on kind of what MessageGears is seeing. And Jacques and Luke, feel free to interrupt me as you see fit in terms of volunteering commentary on any of these topics. But I did put up this quote from Tarek, just talking again about these trends that Luke and Jacques were both talking about, this notion of the connected application model, where the data layer is controlled and owned by the brand. And then there's an ecosystem of applications or platforms that just plug right into that. And that's very much the story with MessageGears. That's our whole kind of historical point of view going back to the founding of the firm. And that's, I think, coming up on probably close to 10 years now, predating even Snowflake to some extent, going back to the days of Hadoop. But it's always been that connected app model. And the reason that MessageGears has had that point of view is, again, really what Jacques and Luke have been talking about. This notion of just it's really not, they've got great tools, but there's this data reliability issue. And we showed this picture earlier, but I'll show it again now. I mean, a lot of enterprise marketers are looking at a MarTech stack that looks, probably something like this. And I know, Jacques, you could really relate to this from your past experience. And really, MessageGears believes, and many others do now, which is great, that the future is really all about putting, your data cloud, I hate to use the term, Luke, but I will, because sometimes people understand it better, but your data warehouse that your in-house data and analytics organization has probably already built out for you, right? That's often the case, right? And sometimes marketers may or may not realize this, but your CTO and her team that runs the data organization has probably got some sort of customer 360 built out. In the old days, that probably lived in a Teradata environment, and now it's in this modern performant data cloud like Snowflake. And so that paradigm shift leads you to actually have the possibility of a connected app MarTech model. And this visual just shows kind of the MessageGears point of view on that, which is, look, we don't store any customer data in our cloud. We simply connect to what the brand has already put in place for themselves in the form of their customer data and their transaction data and their behavioral event data living in a Snowflake type environment. And so given that model, your MarTech tends to look much cleaner, right? You've got a single source of truth in the form of, in this diagram, Snowflake. You might be tapping into the Snowflake marketplace for various data enrichment and identity use cases, among others. And then you've got something like MessageGears just living right on top of that for your segmentation, for your third-party channel activation. So that's your Google, your Facebook, your Pinterest, your Twitter, et cetera. And then MessageGears, very importantly, is an ESP ourselves, right? So we're sending out billions of email push and SMS communications that are highly personalized at the moment of send, based on all the data that we have available to us living in the brand's Snowflake data cloud. So that's a pretty significant paradigm shift. And if you drill down a level deeper, and this is, Luke, where I was going to reinforce some of your points about the Snowflake marketplace and clean room technology. But I also want to give our audience just a framework for a reference architecture. And so what you'll see are 6 kind of common buckets of capability that most marketers align to in terms of the sort of CDP and customer engagement use cases that they are focused on solving for. And this is not unique to MessageGears. This is very similar to a Gartner or a Forrester style framework for sort of CDP capability buckets. But the brands we work with that are aligned to this warehouse first approach tend to have architectures that look a bit like what you see on the screen. So they've got technologies and tool sets for data collection. So what does that mean? In other words, the point of sale system at the store is flowing into their Snowflake environment, typically using some kind of ETL process that's running multiple times a day. So you walk into a store like Home Depot and you make a transaction, that's going to flow into the Home Depot data cloud within a relatively short time frame using traditional ETL processes. Fivetran's a representative of that. And then perhaps more importantly, you've got behavioral data, and behavioral data is just a term for like website activity and mobile app activity. So Walter's on the website, he's browsing certain items. That because he's logged in. Tools like Snowplow and RudderStack are able to inform the marketer that that's taking place. And the way they do that is they collect the data on the website or in the mobile app, and then they deliver it to the data cloud very quickly. And then tools like MessageGears can segment and activate it right against it as soon as it lands in the central source of truth, which is the Snowflake data cloud in this diagram. Then you move into identity and transformation and enrichment use cases, and I think these ones are fascinating to me, but this gets into the challenges around resolving your first-party data that you may have duplicates, in essence. And there's lots of neat tools that let you do this yourself in a deterministic way. Some engineers just use tools like DBT to do that. Others might use third-party tools like Cruelty to do first-party identity resolution in a deterministic way. And then, as Luke alluded to earlier, once you've done your own first-party identity resolution, you actually may still have gaps in your identity models. And there's now a rich ecosystem of identity providers that are made available natively in Snowflake, where you can just connect to them and have them resolve your identity basically in real time using the Snowflake data sharing and data clean room technology. So that is radically different than the old ways of tackling identity resolution, which oftentimes involved stories that Jacques was telling, where you would have to send an enormous file from your data warehouse to a third-party identity provider, and then they would resolve it and send it back to you, and that might take weeks and weeks, and you would have to export and re-import, and it was very painful. The new way of working is that kind of use case is happening in near real time, natively within the Snowflake ecosystem using the data sharing and clean room technology. And then the third use case, which I find fascinating as well, is the enrichment use cases. So the ability for a brand to have a limited amount of data about Walter or Luke, but then be able to tap into third-party data providers to enrich that first-party data, again, in near real time. So that is very transformative to the old ways of working. So if you're missing a mailing address, or if you want to validate a mailing address, or if you want to know if Walter owns a pet or has children, or how long he's lived in his home, or whether he owns or rents it, or whether he's ever had an insurance claim against the home or against the car, those kinds of data points can flow into the brand's data cloud in near real time, which again is very useful for tools like MessageGears, who can then immediately segment, personalize, and activate that data as it gets updated in the brand's single source of truth data cloud. And then as you move to the right here, you move into more traditional use cases. Many brands have proprietary machine learning AI models that they're running, where the outputs of those models live in the brand's data cloud, which is exactly the right answer. So that propensity is appended to Walter's record in Snowflake, such that MessageGears can then segment and activate against it. Those kinds of stories are very common. Every brand is a little bit different in this area, but there are tools out there that give you foundations to do some of this. Continual and Affinio are some of them, but there are many, many more here that help with some of these use cases. And then on the right-hand side, these are the use cases that MessageGears covers as a connected app. I've already mentioned them before. I'm not going to go into too much more detail other than it's kind of what you would expect in terms of enterprise class segmentation and campaign management. We are an ESP, so that's your email, push, and SMS channels, and then we also send audiences to third parties in the ad tech and programmatic space for activation. So I hope this was helpful to the audience. Luke, did you have a comment, buddy? I see you do. Fire away.
Yeah, those last three, I think it's where it's getting really interesting, right? So we're seeing more, at Snowflake, we're seeing more of our partners developing tools to do that segmentation orchestration, within the data cloud, right? Within the data, your data platform, right? And you see more and more announcements even by, more traditional, CDP players say, hey, maybe we want to actually take part of this too, because we see the value there. So it's funny that you see a lot about reverse ETL, a lot about data activation. To me, it's kind of becoming split into two different, categories. You have three here, but one is more of, that the orchestration layer that you have in that one bucket, and then more again the execution side, right? The native channel execution. That's a fairly unique thing to MessageGears. There's not many other players in the space right now doing the native execution, but of course the third-party execution is very common among many of the data activation reverse ETL tools out there. So it's interesting to see, will we see more? What I'm looking forward to in the future, I guess, in this space is, will we see more, more of a shift to that orchestrate, that data warehouse, that data platform, orchestration execution, or will we see orchestration there and execution, in a different platform? So I think there's a lot of moving parts right now that it's changing very fast. And then Jacques, I don't know if you had any thoughts there as well that you wanted to put in on.
Yeah, I've been following this area with a lot of interest. It's been changing very rapidly. But yeah, I think the key here, right, and this is where I'm kind of talking about outcome, is I really like to focus on the activation side, because the activation is what enables the outcome. So for me, right, activation is not sending data from one place to another. Activation is the outcome of that data. So it's sending that email, it's showing that advert. It's like, those are the things that I care about, right? So it's really interesting to see how different players are approaching this from a different kind of perspective. Some people are calling activation just sending data somewhere. Others are really talking about, we'll build the real-time email and send the real-time email to person X, right? It's really interesting what's happening there. The other thing that I'm really kind of liking and starting to see is this kind of, everyone calls it single pane of glass, right? It's that customer 360, and it's exposing that customer 360 to everyone in the organization. And you can only really do that through the warehouse. Something that I kind of wanted to say earlier is, it'd be remiss of me not to say it. I work in cybersecurity. And what we're seeing, right, is you were talking about the separation between in these clean rooms of the data and the execution. And what we've seen with a lot of the traditional kind of ESPs is actually a lot of these are getting hacked. And they're getting hacked because someone is getting access to the ESP systems, their staff. And through their staff, we've all watched Silicon Valley, they'll have God mode. They're able to access your customer data. And so having that separation, I think, is really valuable and important. It's going to become increasingly so as we collect more first-party data. And as we build more, propensity models and whatever other kind of AI machine learning models we might build on top of our data. So yeah, I'm really excited to see this trend. I think from a privacy perspective, it's really positive, and I really like seeing where it's going.
Fantastic, gentlemen. I did have some summary slides, which I think are going to reinforce, frankly, a lot of the points that have already been made, but sometimes a reminder and a picture is, I hope, helpful. So this framework that Jacques wrote about so eloquently last April, and obviously we've been talking about today, has a lot of kind of operational benefits in terms of real-time segmentation and one-to-one personalization at massive scale. I think this point here on the bottom is one that I think is pretty powerful. This bringing marketing and enterprise data teams together. So it's sort of breaking down silos. We see this a lot with our clients. Like it's very much a hand-in-hand relationship that gets developed because, more often than not, as I mentioned earlier, the enterprise data team inside of a large B2C brand has already built out some sort of data foundation for customer data. And then when you bring in this connected app model, that data foundation that the enterprise data team has built becomes the primary foundation for the entire business. And it opens up a collaborative life cycle between the marketing and other constituencies that Jacques mentioned within the org to really build out that data model to service not only the marketer's needs, but other parts of the org in terms of finance and planning and what have you. So it's pretty cool to see with the customers that we work with to see how those teams come together and break down walls and break down technology silos in this sort of connected app model. So this is a little bit of what we're seeing in terms of deployments, whether it's MessageGears or any other kind of connected app approach, just by nature of the fact that it is a connected app, it just means that the deployment is just faster, right? Because you're just plugging into a data model that already exists within the brand that then evolves over time. So you're plugging into the brand's Snowflake environment where they've built out their own taxonomies for customer data and transaction data and behavioral event data. And because of that, there is no need to map fields and do synchronizations between one environment and another. The nature of the connected app deployment model is you're just plugging into what already exists within the brand's data warehouse in terms of data structures. And then the security aspects are not to be deminimized. Jacques and Luke have hit this one pretty hard. Your customer data never leaves your data cloud. That's pretty darn important in the world that we live in. The personalization aspects we've talked about, and then I shouldn't leave this slide without mentioning that this kind of model is less expensive, not only in terms of licensing, but just in terms of operational overhead. So the hard and soft costs are significantly less relative to more traditional approaches for these kinds of use cases. I'm going to wrap with just a couple of final points on like who the heck is doing this within the world. Rakuten's a longstanding customer of MessageGears. We're a big fan of this quote in terms of just this notion, and really, Jacques, you started with this at the beginning of the call. Once you connect your MarTech to your single source of truth, which is Snowflake in today's talk track, and that is the case actually with Rakuten. They're a longstanding Snowflake Data Cloud customer. You can do anything you can think about. The technology just gets out of the way, and it just becomes more about use cases and business value. And then finally, I do think, I just wanted to show a visual of the kinds of brands that have adopted the models that we're talking about today with Jacques and Luke. I mean, this is something that pretty large enterprise brands, not only that are in the sort of traditional retail bucket, but are also in the sort of digital native bucket have adopted, but you'll also see that there are some mid-sized brands in the mix here as well. You know, Orlando Magic is one that comes to mind. They're a industry-leading, experience-driven organization, but they don't have a huge in-house data and analytics organization. But the team that they do have is really sharp, and they've got all their fan data living in their Snowflake, and then MessageGears just plugs right into it. So it does run the gamut from some of your biggest brands on the planet to also smaller, more agile, more data-driven organizations like Orlando Magic and Culver's and others. So with that, look at that. We got pretty lengthy there, didn't we, guys? But we have about 10 minutes left. Although I think I'm going to let the crowd go in about 5 minutes. But I did have two questions, Luke and Jacques, that did come in. I know I wrote them down here somewhere. Here we go. And maybe this one is the best one to focus on. And Jacques and Luke, I'll let you each answer this one. And I think it's a really good one. So, you know, what kind of organization is a good fit for the connected app model? And conversely, you know, who might be a better fit for more of a traditional SaaS managed app type model? Luke, you want to take that one first, and then maybe Jacques, you can pontificate as well?
Sure. Yeah, so again, kind of echoing what I said earlier about having a good relationship between, you know, the marketing and the data team, right? You need a strong data engineering team. You need to have a team that can help you set up that customer 360, that single pane of glass that Jacques was talking about earlier, inside of your cloud data platform, right? Inside of your Snowflake account. That's kind of, you know, one key aspect. And I would say more generally, you know, you think about the bigger, I would say that this is for now probably more prone to the bigger organizations out there, right? The more data you have means the more data you have to move when you're using a more maybe managed app approach, right? Or have to coordinate. So again, with a connected app approach, there's no data movement, so you don't have to coordinate as much and to have as many moving parts, I think.
Perfect. Jacques, what's your perspective on what an organization needs to have in place for a connected app model versus who might be a better fit for the more traditional managed app approach in your perspective? And hopefully that question makes sense, by the way.
No, it does. And I think they need sufficient pain, right? They need to understand that they need to have that pain point in the business. They need to be facing those struggles. They need to be thinking about the commercial opportunities that might exist with first-party data they might be collecting. I think that's a trend we've seen that certainly over the last decade is businesses are massively more savvy in terms of the commercial opportunities that they have with data. And that drives a large impetus towards one, forming a data team, and two, putting data into a warehouse, at which point you can start to exploit these new technologies. A lot of companies, you know, if your entire source of truth is a CRM, you're probably going to be struggling. And there are a lot of businesses that probably this isn't a good fit for. But actually, you know, I work for a startup, and I'm really lucky in that we're able to build effectively kind of what we want from the ground up, and we don't have massive legacy data. So for any new organization, I think it's really exciting potentially, or particularly with kind of, you know, Snowflake's pricing model is very, very cheap if you have small amounts of data. You know, for us, we see very small costs. So you can start to build this really exciting new way of working and really kind of solving these core customer pains in a really cheap and effective way. And at some point, yes, you will need a data team, but actually you don't, so long as you have kind of a technical person or two, which if you're working for certainly a SaaS or a technology-driven business, you'll have those skill sets within the organization. So you don't necessarily need an entire data team. We don't have a data team yet. We have a CTO who is doing data engineering, and we have a BI analyst who is doing the analysis and some of the DBT modeling. So you don't need a data team. You just need the appetite and the hunger.
I love that. That's an awesome point. And Jacques, you said a bunch of really good things there. The one thing you said, which I really love, is the commercial opportunities that may arise from your first party data. And I think that's a biggie that I'm remiss that I didn't mention that to some extent, but this notion of, it reminds me of a story with one of our customers when they first came to us, and they, they had a data cloud and a pretty mature data leadership, but they were using a more traditional managed app SaaS solution for what MessageGears now does for them. So with the incumbent that they were using before deploying MessageGears, they were only able to share, I think, about 40 data points from their data cloud to the third-party SaaS solution, because it was a nightly sync, and they had to create custom fields in the third-party SaaS solution, and then map to those fields and have an ETL process running every night to get data out of their data cloud and over to the third-party SaaS solution and landing in the right place. Now they sunsetted that traditional SaaS solution and moved to the MessageGears connected app model, and they've expanded the amount of data that they have about each customer that lives in their data cloud. So they went from 40 data points to something like 1,400 data points about every single known customer of the brand. And mind you, those data points could be anything from the obvious demographic ones to things like propensity models and stuff like that. So, Walter is this kind of consumer based on a propensity model that's running, and so he's a candidate for this kind of offer. But I think I tell that story only to think about, well, 1,700 or 1,400 data points about every single customer, and that number grows, kind of every month across tens of millions of customers. That's a pretty rich first-party data foundation that is extremely strategic and extremely valuable for any number of use cases, including data sharing, actually, where you're obfuscating the PII, but collaborating with channel partners, both upstream and downstream, which is not to mention also the retail media network use cases that come up increasingly with some of these larger brands that have very rich first-party data sets that they are able to then monetize in various ways. So Jacques, thank you for bringing that point up, and you gave me a chance to tell that story as well. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. The final question that was asked, which is the reason I put this slide up, is somebody asked just to be reminded of the sort of business benefits of a connected app, kind of warehouse native deployment model. So I did want to leave today with that reminder that, Jacques, you frankly hit nearly all of these when you were talking at the beginning of the webinar. But I'll leave everyone with that. And I do want to thank Jacques and Luke so much for your time today. I didn't realize we'd go 55 minutes, but I think it was a great conversation, and I learned a lot, and I look forward to doing it again with you guys soon. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, always a pleasure.
Cheers. Thanks, guys.